Good morning from Berlin. It's a fresh morning in Berlin. It's a bit sunny occasionally, but also raining. Typical April weather still. My name is Matthias Buck, and together with my colleague Marthe Kleiner, sitting to my right-hand side, we will present to you today a study that we have recently done on the state of the EU energy transition as it looks like in 2015. We have some 100 pre-registered participants for this webinar, and this makes for an interesting session in presenting the report. Now, this report is, as I said, on the state of affairs in the European power sector in 2015. The main questions we are addressing are: where are we coming from and where do we stand today? And in the report, we are looking at these questions for key issues like power generation, power consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, or prices. It is the first time that Agora has been doing this type of state of affairs at EU level report, and as all first-time efforts, there is certainly scope to improve. And we will indeed have the opportunity to do so in the future, since we plan to have an annual state of affairs report as of now. Next time, of course, focusing on 2016. Now, given this background, we are very much looking forward to your feedback on this report and to the questions you might have. But before going to the substance, some organizational remarks. All information on this webinar can be found on our website. This, of course, concerns the study itself, called Energy Transition in the Power Sector in Europe, State of Affairs in 2015. The webinar presentation and the webinar recording, which you can access through a YouTube channel. You can already now download the slides we use for the presentation via the webinar software. And if you're looking at your screen at the moment, there should be an arrow appearing and guiding you to the icon on your screen where you can download the slides. Furthermore, you should now see on your screen a chat window opening up. And now this window is helpful if you want to send us real-time questions. Now, any questions you send to us during the webinar, we will try to take up during the Q&A session, Q&A part of this session afterwards. In case we do not manage to run through all the questions, we will follow up in email as far as possible. If you pose a question in this chat window, it will appear on our screen. However, the other participants in the webinar will not see it, but I will, in flagging the questions, kind of read them out so everybody participating in the webinar can fully appreciate what has been asked. It would be kind if when you're posing the question, also mention your name and affiliation, but this is really no precondition for us to reply to questions. Now, if there are any kind of technical difficulties that you experience, for instance, if I'm speaking with too low a voice, if a mic is not working, etc., please also use the chat window to point this out. My colleague Nicolas Bock, who is sitting to my left, whom you cannot see on your screen, will try to help with those technical issues as much as possible. And thank you, Nicolas, for doing that. But let's move to the content. Mara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Before we start with the figures themselves, I would like to make a few remarks on why we come out with such preliminary figures this early, while the official figures themselves take much longer. We believe that it is crucial for European power market politics to work with reliable and most recent data in order to react to developments of the past few years, evaluate whether certain regulations has impact or not, and develop market frameworks for the next decades. This is why we asked the Öko-Institut to develop a methodology which grasps the development of the last year and draws a picture of the status of the energy transition within the EU. All data for 2015 and in a few cases for 2014 in our report is therefore preliminary and accordingly marked. For some countries, recent and reliable data is already available, but in order to work with coherent data on an EU level, we have decided to use Eurostat and ENTSO-E data. You can find detailed information on the methodology in the report available on our website. Let's now dive into some figures of our analysis on the state of affairs of the EU Energy Transition 2015. Let's first take a look at the generation mix in 2015. Displayed in parentheses are the 2014 figures. The largest contributor to the generation are renewables with 28.8%. They are followed by nuclear with 26.8%, coal with about 26%, and gas with 15%. Among the renewables, wind and hydropower produced most. The largest increases we observed in wind and PV, and the hydropower decreased by 1.3 percentage points due to poor precipitation, especially in the south. In total, 3,204 terawatt-hours power were produced, of which were 923 terawatt-hours renewables, which increased from 2010 through 2015 by 244 terawatt-hours, which is about 36%. In contrast, the production from gas-fired power plants decreased by 283 terawatt-hours, which is more than a third. Coal power production remained on the same level with a slight peak of plus 10% in 2012 and 2013. Mainly due to the nuclear phase-out in Germany, we observed a decline in nuclear power production to about 860 terawatt-hours in 2015. On the flip side, the consumption side, we see that the power consumption decreased only slightly by less than 1% compared to 2005. You can see that on the left side of the slide. In the same time frame, the GDP, however, increased by 9%, which means that the consumption did not follow the economic growth closely anymore, which we believe is due to more efficient industrial processes, an increase in energy efficient appliances, and the effects of the Eco-Design Directive. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that two-thirds of the EU power, about 2,000 terawatt-hours, is consumed in 5 countries. Germany consumed 600 terawatt-hours power, France about 500 terawatt-hours. Those two are followed by Italy, Spain, and the UK. In these 5 countries, the consumption is now lower than in 2005. Compared to 2014, consumption was about 50 terawatt-hours higher in total in 2015 due to the warm winter in 2014, which lowered the demand. In 2015, renewables supplied about 28.6% of consumption, which is 8.3 percentage points more than in 2010. It appears that this steep increase from 2011 through 2015 did not continue. However, this is due to the poor hydropower exploitation in 2015. The share of renewables without hydropower shows that the steep increase continues also in 2015, especially due to high shares of wind and PV. Among the renewables, more than two-thirds come from wind and hydropower. Within the past 5 years, twice as much wind power was produced. Solar power quadrupled its production, and about 45 terawatt-hours more of biomass power were produced. These three technologies also experienced large capacity additions in these 5 years. Hydropower, however, remained on the same level as 2010. If we look at the fuel prices, and these are European, respectively international fuel prices, we can see that all of them declined significantly in 2015. The oil price decreased from about more than 50 euro per megawatt hour in 2013 to about 30 euro per megawatt hour in 2015. The gas price decreased from about 30 euro per megawatt hour in 2013 to about 22 euro per megawatt hour in 2015, and coal is now at around 6 euro per megawatt hour. The CO2 price increased slightly in 2015 to 7.62 euros per ton CO2. The fuel price development had also an impact on the marginal costs of common thermal power plants. The marginal cost of gas-fired power plants decreased to around 40 euro per megawatt hour, and the increased CO2 price also increased the marginal cost of old hard coal-powered power plants to around 25 euro per megawatt hour, and the price of the marginal cost of old lignite power plants to around 15 euro per megawatt hour in 2015. If in 2015 the CO2 price were around 35 euro per ton CO2, the marginal cost of all three types would have been on a similar level of around 50 euro per megawatt hour. In 2016, we already experienced a little lower fuel prices in the first months, which means that a CO2 price of 30 euro per ton CO2 would have been sufficient for a fuel switch. We also took a look at the European electricity exchanges and their prices. We saw decreases at the Nord Pole exchange, which had prices of around 50 euro per megawatt hour in 2011 and is now in 2015 at 20 euro per megawatt hour. In Germany and Austria, this power price was 50 euro per megawatt hour in 2011 and was in 2015 at around 30 euro per megawatt hour. And in Italy, we saw electricity prices of 70 euro per megawatt hour in 2011 and 50 euro per megawatt hour in 2015. In Spain, Portugal, France and the UK, power prices increased from 2014 to 2015. However, the sample mean shows a decreasing trend and is in 2015 at around 40 euro per megawatt hour. We also took a look at the trade among countries, among member states and their neighboring countries. We can see that the largest nominal exporters include France, Germany and Sweden, and the largest nominal importers include Italy, Belgium and the Netherlands. But we also saw, and this you cannot see in this map, we also looked at how much of the energy consumed within one country was covered with imports. And we observed that Lithuania covered almost half of its consumption with imports, Croatia about 40%, Latvia about a quarter, and a similar pattern was observed in Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, Italy and the Netherlands. Turning to the CO2 emissions of the power sector, we can see that the CO2 emissions are 18.3% lower in 2005 in 2015, and 12% lower in 2015 than in 2010. In 2015, more than half of the CO2 emissions of the power sector come from coal. And if the decline in gas-fired power production since 2010 were in coal instead, we would have emissions which would be around 100 million tons lower, which is about 10% of the emissions of the power sector. In the total GHG emissions of the EU were in 2015 23% lower than in 1990, which means that the EU 2020 target has been achieved early. What are our 4 main takeaways? In 2015, renewables were the largest power source. We observed 3 key trends for 2010 through 2015. Gas and nuclear were losing ground. Renewables contribute much more to the power generation, and coal is on the same level as in 2010. CO2 emissions increased 2% compared to 2015 and would be much lower if the coal decline would have been coal declined instead of gas. And what are we expecting for 2016? We are expecting more renewable energy production due to capacity additions in wind and PV, less coal power production due to the carbon floor price in the UK, which will lower the UK's coal power production, less consumption due to a rather mild winter in the first few months of 2016, and due to a lower certificate demand, also a lower CO2 price. I'm now turning over to Matthias for the Q&A session.
Yes, thank you, Mara, for leading us into the report. We have relatively few questions so far, but I just take up one by Mr. Jobse from Accenture. He was asking, it's essentially a methodological question, whether the demand and production figures refer to the offtake from the grid only, or whether they do include decentralized generation with only local consumption, which I take to be like behind the meter activities.
I assume you refer to the difference between net and gross generation figures. In this report, we concentrate on the net figures as what the figures on the
Okay. Do you want to perhaps, because I have no further questions for the moment, I would encourage those listening to our webinar to ask some questions. We have the time all for you now. Otherwise, I'm happy to ask some questions myself. Now, I think one important statement we're making is on the slight increase of CO2 emissions and how this is coming about. And perhaps because you mentioned this in your presentation, you might want to give a bit more detail on that, that you said there was an increase and this could have been avoided by X number of tons. Du musst etwas lauter sprechen, ja. Mara is just getting information that people feel she could speak a bit louder. Yes.
I hope this is better now. We have looked at the emissions split up among renewables, so which, not renewables, I'm sorry. We looked how the emissions are distributed among the energy sources, so lignite, hard coal, gas, and other, including oil. And we can see on the slide you can see right now that the emissions from lignite and hard coal are about on the same level, even though the production, which you can see on this slide, changed slightly, which you can see here. And that the gas emissions, there we are, decreased by about 40%, 38%. However, the emissions from power production from gas is about a third lower than in 2010. So if we would switch the decrease from gas to a decrease in coal, the impact on the emissions would have been much higher, as the impact of coal emission-wise is much higher. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Mara, and we are now, actually questions are coming in. That's very positive. Please continue asking questions. The next question is on the one slide you were showing where there seemed to be a slight decoupling of electricity consumption and GDP development. And there's a question from Ms. Blautova from Prague asking, what do we consider are the main factors behind this development? Sorry, I was probably too fast. So the question from Ms. Blautova is the following. You stated that there is an increase in consumption while the GDP, in fairly stable consumption while the GDP is growing. And what do you believe are the factors behind this?
Thank you very much for your question. We believe that this is due to three factors, and as I mentioned before, this is mainly due to more efficient industrial processes we experience all over Europe. Also, an overall increase in electric appliances, especially household appliances, but also other appliances in the GHD and industrial sector, and also a few effects of the Eco Design Directive, especially the switch to LED bulbs instead of classical bulbs. I hope this answers the question.
Yes, thank you, Mara. And there is another question from Mr. Sharman, and he is in a way asking, he's asking whether the decline in dispatchable capacity in Europe, what does it mean? What's the economic case for keeping it open? And how will lost dispatchable capacity be replaced? Now, this is probably beyond the focus of this study, which is primarily focusing on what is the state of play in Europe, where are we coming from, so kind of drawing out the energy statistical figures and saying where do we stand. And the question is really on, I believe, the dynamics, the economics in the power sector. And if you are interested in this particular question, you might keep following us, because we have a second webinar scheduled for 11:30 today, in which my colleague Christian Redl and I will present a second study, which we call the Power Market Pentagon, which is squarely focusing on the issues Mr. Sharman is raising in his question, i.e. what are the incentive, what's the current incentive structure governing investor choices in the European power system. In particular, how do we see the necessary decline of, for instance, inflexible coal capacity in the system, and how do the different elements shaping investor choices play out. There is a similar question by Mr. O'Brien from the University of Exeter, who is highlighting that the UK has been quite successful in phasing out coal, and whether this is something that could be replaced more widely, could be replicated more widely in Europe, elsewhere. And indeed, that's an interesting development in the UK. There's probably some discussion to be had on why, particularly at this time, the UK government has decided to phase out coal. But I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there is a discussion in Germany on coal phase out, not least initiated by a proposal from Agora earlier this year. There's also a webinar, I believe, on our coal phase out proposal, which is still generating quite a bit of discussion. I'm aware there's also a discussion on phasing out coal in the Netherlands. Some of these discussions we're also addressing in this Power Pentagon study, which I mentioned earlier, which we will present in a second webinar today at 11:30. Let me just, because the questions are coming in quickly now. Okay. Alistair McGear is asking on the French carbon floor price and what this would imply for phasing out coal in Germany. Again, I think, apologies for that, but this is something we should take up in the webinar we have a bit later, because this is really on the dynamics in the European power system. Mr. Sharman is asking a second question, and I try to see it in full. Okay, this is more, he's pointing out that in his observation, industry is leaving the EU, CO2 intensive industry moving to Asia. This is of course a certain perspective on the industrial context in Europe. I think there are different perspectives as well. This is something we have not particularly looked at. I just want to point out that of course there are huge exemptions for in particular energy intensive users from EU level rules on, for instance, the emissions trading system, but also at national level. If you're looking at different member states, you will find that particularly energy intensive industries are often exempted from charges or particular price add-ons, for instance, for increasing the share of renewables. This is, I think, an interesting question from, I hope I get the name right, a Czech colleague, Boryov Kula, and he's asking, Mara, I think this is to you, why is CO2 rising? Is it a trend? So just something that we would expect to continue in the future, or only an exception for this year? So, Mara, I think this is really for you.
Thank you very much for this question. I think that due to the coal phase out or declining coal power production in the UK, we might observe a little less CO2 emissions in the power sector in the next year or in this year, with figures beginning next year. Also, the mild winter 2016 we are observing right now might decrease power production in general. However, the high coal power production in Germany and also Poland, the Czech Republic and other countries will keep up the high emissions from coal. So I think we can hopefully observe a stagnating trend in the next year, but a real decline in CO2 emissions will require more coal decline and more gas power production in general. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Mara, and I think this is also replying to the question posed on the same topic by Mr. Mauger, or Mauger, probably Romain Mauger from France, who had a fairly similar question. Now there are a few other questions coming in which are really on the dynamics of national minimum CO2 prices currently being discussed in France, for instance. There is something in place already in the UK, and you might have seen, if you had time, that in the study on the power market Pentagon that we have been publishing a few days back, we are also asking for a minimum carbon price to be put in place to, in a way, help investor certainty in Europe. There is an interesting question from Mr. McGarr coming in, whether what would be the effects of kind of a patchwork approach to minimum carbon pricing throughout Europe. And I think this is a question my colleague Christian and I will reflect upon, and let's take it up later on in the second webinar. There is another question on the role of natural gas by Mr. Stolle, and he is asking what role natural gas could play in reducing CO2 emissions and the role, the future role of gas we see in the system. Mara, perhaps you want to take that one.
Well, this again leads towards the CO2 emissions, as the gas-fired power production is much less CO2 intensive than coal-fired power production. We expect that the role of gas will increase as the power production of coal might decrease. So I think all of the future of gas is coupled to the future of coal, and a CO2 efficient power system requires, at least in the midterm, gas as a supplement to renewable power production.
Yes, and if I perhaps may comment on that point, and this is, of course, you can observe as well in the study on where do we stand today, that you can see that there has been a decline in the contribution of gas to power in Europe over the past years since 2010. At the same time, coal has been kind of stable. Yeah? And one of the observations, just looking at the greenhouse gas emissions, of course, is that if the contribution made by coal to the power system, to power generation, would have been made by gas instead, that CO2 emissions in Europe would have been much lower in the last year, which is picking up some or the other question on, is this a momentary peak that we're seeing in CO2 emissions or not, or is this a broader trend? Now, my understanding, based on the other study we have been doing on the power market dynamics as such, is that, of course, this very much depends on whether the market expectation for more flexible generation in the market will, how this will develop in the future. And there is a combination of factors that is determining this, in particular the ETS price, but of course also the general situation of capacity in the European power system. At this point we are seeing quite some overcapacity in absolute terms beyond peak capacity in Europe, and much of this capacity is inflexible baseload and fairly cheap baseload capacity, in particular lignite and hard coal. And of course, if you have overcapacity, if you have more supply than demand, prices are down, and this is exactly the situation we're having in Europe, that in particular the gas-fired generation has less opportunities to make any profit from the market. This is why we're seeing a reduction in gas being sold, and of course also some mothballing of gas-fired generation. And looking at the future power system that needs to be much more flexible, which is developed around renewables, this is of course not a trend that would be desirable, but you would like to see a different quality of mix that is much more flexible, as Mara said, as a counterpart to renewables, which are volatile in nature, particularly if the share of wind and solar PV is increasing in the system, as we expect to increase simply looking at the economics of renewables. So in that sense, and now perhaps going back to the question by Mr. Stolle, in that sense, we do see that gas plays an important role in the system. So from a systemic perspective, as a counterpart of renewables, of course also as a preferable fossil fuel that has less CO2 intensity than coal-fired generation. At the same time, I think it is important to be pretty clear that we don't expect a huge increase in absolute installed capacity of gas-fired generation, simply because we are having Europe and also Germany has some clear politically set targets for efficiency. We have set targets for increasing the share of renewables in the system. So an absolute, the absolute amount of gas-fired power that will be needed in the system in the future, this is probably going to be fairly stable in Europe in the next decades. Now, this being said, if you're looking, for instance, at what the Commission presented earlier this year, what they called the winter package, where they had been, where there are some, let's say, statements on the expectation on the gas demand in Europe, we're looking at this quite, and we have, let's put this way, we have some questions on kind of the demand projections included there that we believe to be too optimistic, put it this way, because if you're contrasting the projections based on target achievement of the 2030 targets the EU has set itself, then you would probably have a much lower demand for gas in the range of 45% lower gas than the Commission has recently published in its winter package. Okay, now I've been speaking so much that I didn't follow the next questions. Okay, there is another question by Mr. Zier, and he is asking in which countries, so member states I assume, we are expecting a growing renewables market. Mara, do you want to say a word on that?
I certainly can. We observed in the last year, especially capacity additions in wind offshore and a lot of wind onshore as well. The wind offshore sector actually kind of took off last year in Germany and the UK. And this capacity additions during the year will also have an impact on this year's increase in wind offshore power production, as their full capacity is will show in 2016. We also expect some solar capacity additions all over Europe, but I think the main focus will be on wind, especially in Poland and Germany and I think the UK. Matthias, you might add to that.
Thank you, Mara. I was in the meantime. I was actually trying to read some of the further questions coming in, just to encourage you again to ask questions if you have some. As you see, we are working to pick them up as much as possible. Yeah, I don't really have much to add to what Mara just said. I believe much will depend on whether member states now in the next months and years will put in place clear national pathways on how they plan to increase the share of renewables. And we are seeing, of course, from the economic side, it's getting more and more interesting to invest into renewables if you're increasing, building new capacity. There is an issue that was already mentioned that we have at the moment overcapacity in most member states, in particular a question that we're also discussing very much in Germany, but as I said, it's also discussed in the UK and the Netherlands. How do you deal with baseload, inflexible capacity, in particular coal, that is making some of these new investments less profitable?
I might actually add to that we also looked at which countries provide most to the renewables production, and we also have a backup slide to that. Let me just go to that as quickly as I can. Here you can see on the left-hand side that a lot of the production, renewables production, is actually produced in 5 countries: Germany, Italy, Spain, Sweden and France. And you can also see that the hydropower production, actually it shows the same picture for all 3 main sources: hydropower, wind and PV. We did not, I think, do that for biomass. That there's always 5 large producers of this power source, and that most of those are actually increasing, actually due to the poor precipitation in the south. The hydropower production declined in most countries except Sweden, where it increased. We perceived a rather good precipitation in the north. And you can see here that the wind power production really took off in 2015. This is mostly due to the offshore connection to the UK and Germany. In those 2, the power production from wind actually increased, and in the other 3 main contributors it rather stagnated, which we believe is also due to the different or changed remuneration mechanisms in those countries. The solar power production did not see such a large increase in the past year compared to the previous 4 years, which is also due to the fact that the solar capacity additions weren't as high in the last year as in the years before.
We have another question by Mr. Sharman, and this is probably following up on what Mara and I said on the role of gas. So there seems to be quite some interest in the role of gas. And I understand this is a fairly technical question on relating to the fuel efficiency of gas turbines he's proposing, and asking whether this is the solution to the flexibility challenge. Of course, this is when referring to the role of gas in the system. This is not stating that we believe gas is the only solution to the flexibility challenge, but it is one kind of flexibility option that we see in the system, which of course on the generating side has more flexibility than, for instance, some of the other fossil capacities. So this being said, I just want to make this clear. Gas for us is one flexibility option. It is preferable for its less CO2 intensity over, for instance, coal generation. But of course there are other flexibility options, and if you're interested in some of the work that we have been doing in that regard, let me just draw your attention to some other studies, particularly on the pentalateral context, where colleagues have been working on flexibility options, looking at the northwestern European power system quite in depth, and there they are looking at different flexibility options. One, and I think this has not been mentioned in the presentation, it's also not featuring in this study, is of course interconnection and the increasing coupling of physically coupling of power networks in Europe, which does have a significant smoothing effect on the fluctuation of power generation from volatile renewable sources, and as such is picking up quite a bit of the flexibility challenge as we see it. A second, not yet economically perfect solution is of course storage, but we are aware that a lot is happening in the storage area that might be available with good economic figures in a few years' time, when the flexibility challenge, as we see it coming, is increasing. At the moment, in our analysis, expanding the network and enhancing interconnectivity is actually the cheapest flexibility option that we see. And this, but as I was saying, this is very much explained and analyzed in more detail in some of the work colleagues of us have been doing on the pentalateral context. There's a let me just try. The window is difficult to see sometimes. So, okay, this is Mara, for you a very it's a methodological question, and if you cannot reply to it immediately, then we will probably follow it up by email. And this is a question on how we measure greenhouse gas emissions. Do we take into account only the emissions by burning or the full emissions? The question is particularly on methane leakage, a subject that is increasingly assessed worldwide, in particular as regards shale gas extraction. So the question is, how comprehensive is our analysis of greenhouse gas emissions in the report that we've been doing? Mara, over to you.
Thank you very much for this question. In our report itself, we only consider CO2 emissions of the power sector, and we refer to the EEA for the greenhouse gas emissions, the GHG emissions. So I would like to follow up on that via email and check it out for you, and we'll get back to you to that, if that's okay with you. Thank you.
We are not yet exhausted, but there are no new questions coming in at the moment. So I can only encourage you to ask, continue asking us, because we still have 10 more minutes to go. And of course, we would like to use them to the maximum effect. There is a question I'm informed about on hydro. Yes, and this, so Ms. Blautova from Prague is asking, fine, there's an expansion of wind energy in Germany, but also in other member states, particularly in the UK. What about hydro? And now the question has disappeared from my screen again. Where is it? Here. What about hydro? There is a decrease in generation of hydropower units on your slide. How do you expect future development of hydropower in Germany? Now, so I think that there are two parts on this. Mara, are we actually documenting a decrease of hydro capacity or just production from hydro? And the second is on future development of hydro in Germany and perhaps elsewhere in Europe as we see it.
Thank you very much for this question. I already flipped to the slide where we can see how hydro is distributed among the member states. The capacity of hydropower all over Europe remains on a very similar level in the past 5 years. The fluctuation of hydropower in those years is mainly and most foremost due to the precipitation in the member countries. And as you can see here on the slide, the main contributors are Sweden, France, Italy, Austria, and Spain. So we can certainly say that Germany is not one of the largest contributors to hydropower, which is also due to the fact that the hydropower in Germany is certainly not the largest priority here, and due to its price, we do not expect any larger capacity additions in the next few years in Germany. The main focus on capacity additions in Germany is on wind and PV. I think this answers your question as good as possible.
So thank you, Mara. In the meantime, some of you are using the last-minute opportunities. We have a question from Mr. Zhang, and he is asking whether we can share information on current price ceilings in the power market, and what about negative prices. Now, on the second point, I don't have the figures in my head. I just want to highlight to you that in the state of play on the German energy transition that we published earlier, a few weeks ago, we published this on the German energy transition. That's also an annual study we're doing. We have a particular section on negative prices and how it evolved in the last year. And broadly speaking, if I remember correctly, but Mara is probably better informed, is that negative prices have become more frequent. So the number of events has become more frequent, but at the same time, the magnitude of negative prices has declined. Perhaps Mara, you want to say a word on that?
I am just opening the respective slide to it. However, you can see it, you cannot see it. I just want to make sure that I give you the right figures to it. We experienced in Germany and Austria 126 hours with negative prices in 2015, which is almost twice as much as in the prior year, where we experienced 64 hours. However, the mean negative price is now only around minus 9 euros per megawatt hour, and was much higher in the prior years, with about minus 15 euros in per megawatt hour in 2014 and minus 70 euros per megawatt hour in 2012. And the lowest price we observed in the Austrian and German power markets, day-ahead markets in 2015 was minus 79.94 euros per megawatt hour, while the lowest price in 2012 was minus 221.99 euros per megawatt hour. However, we don't have analysis on the data all over Europe. I only have those data on the German market for now, but we could follow up on that if you'd like.
Yes, thank you, Mara. And now, before going to another question, more specifically on the EU renewables target and how it could be achieved, I just want to reply to a few other questions coming in on gas and versus coal and how this interacts with renewables. Just again to advertise the next webinar we're doing at 11:30 with my colleague Christian Redl and I. One of the key elements there we will be looking at is precisely what to do about the current situation where inflexible coal baseload capacity is pushing more flexible capacity out of the market simply because of the current the way the market is currently functioning and the economic incentives that exist. And we have some particular proposals in that regard, but this is really for the webinar in half an hour. So you're very welcome to join that one, or if you don't find the time to join it, then please take a look at the Power Market Pentagon study in which we're developing these ideas. Now, there is a question from Ms. Stichinsky from, seems India. The name sounds more like Eastern European to me, but so Mrs. Stichinsky, you are asking how is the EU 2030 renewables goal of at least 27% renewable share implemented at the national level and the division of labor to make this happen. Now this, I think, is an important question that indeed is debated intensively in the member states, in Brussels at the moment. So in a way, you are pointing out that the current system, and this is probably the system that we are reporting on, we have in Europe a renewable energy directive, which is setting out national targets for the share of renewable energy in the power system of member states, referring to gross domestic consumption, the share of renewables. And in the future, and this is based on a decision of EU heads of state and government in October 2014, in the future we will not have, so after 2020, we will not have nationally binding targets in the future renewable energy directive, at least if the decision on this by EU heads of state and government stands, which normally is the case. But just to flag that the European Parliament has repeatedly called for national targets to be continued. So this is indeed an interesting debate. So broadly speaking, if there are less binding and biting measures at EU level to push member states to reach their national targets, in the worst case take them to court. If they don't comply, then of course I would expect that there will be more kind of carrots, more incentives to be put in place to incentivize member states to actually contribute to reaching the collective EU level target. But this is an interesting debate. There is a lot out there. If you want to get an Agora view on that, there is something in the Power Market Pentagon paper, but in addition, Agora made a submission to the public consultation on the Renewable Energy Directive, where we're listing some of the core ideas that we see for the EU to collectively achieve the 27% target. Yes, a follow-up question on the issue of negative prices, Mara. Mr. Zhang is asking, why do you see the negative, so the negativity of the negative prices, the magnitude of negativity shrinking? Are these reduced subsidies, or what's the reason behind? And after this, I guess this is the last question, we will have to wrap up. And yeah, so last question, Mr. Zhang, for you.
Thank you very much. We don't really have true insights to that. We did a study on negative prices, however this is already 2 years ago. It's called Negative Prices, I think, and it's also available to, at least in small parts, in English. We assume that it is mostly due to the fact that with negative prices more generation units, also renewable generation units, are taken off the grid as they are not receiving subsidies, remuneration for those periods of time if they exceed 6 hours. So we assume that this is part of the play. I think we are certainly interested in how this works, as this 6-hour rule has been implemented in beginning this year. We will follow up on our negative electricity prices study, and we'll be able to answer your question more in detail within the next year or two.
Yeah, indeed, that's an interesting question. As a political scientist, I would say there's also bit of collective learning at play, that some of the market participants, including the baseload capacity generators, are actually seeing, kind of reconsidering, do we really have to run all the time, or what margins do we have for generating a bit more flexibly? And I just recall that I saw some information where we're looking at particular coal-fired generators, where you could see that they had become more flexible in their generating profile. Now, thanks for all your questions. I think this was interesting. We did not manage to reply to all the questions, in particular 1 or 2 very technical questions, which we will follow up by email with you, as I said before. Sometimes, of course, it's not possible to reply to all technical details, simply because you will need to look up something yourself before you put together a reply. Now, I hope you enjoyed it as much as Mara and I enjoyed it. Nicola was very busy at the same time, sitting to my left. You couldn't see her, but I think she enjoyed it as well. She is still smiling. That's good. Now, a practical question. There will be a second webinar, as I mentioned a few times. Colleagues have been asking, what do I do if I want to participate in the second webinar as well? And Nicola, have you been typing a reply to every? Okay. Yes, my colleague Nicola, she has sent a message to all, so you should be able to read how you, I think it's at 11:03, in case you're not registered, and then so you can read it, how to do it practically. So as I said, the second study will be on what we call the power market Pentagon. The focus really is on how to look at EU power market design, how it should be further developed, so that the power system transformation, as we see it, will happen cost effectively. That's the first point I want to make. So practically, how do you participate in the next webinar as well? The second point is really encouraging you, if you are interested in staying up to date with what we are doing, things we're publishing, but also webinars like today. If you want to be kept up to date, I recommend that you subscribe to our newsletter, you can do it on the Agora website. I can assure you that we are not spamming you with information, but we actually also have an interest to only send out mailings if there's something worthwhile to mention. So new publications, new events. So thank you for participating. Thank you for your questions. As I was saying, thank you to Mara. Yes. Thank you to Nicola, who you didn't see her, but we changed that at some point, Nicola, that you are also visible at least at some point. And I hope to welcome some of you again at the next webinar that starts in 30 minutes. So please stay in touch, and we will follow up on some of your more technical questions by email. Thanks. Goodbye.